claims that he makes in Bowling Alone, the larger claims, but I read Bowling Alone to check out the smaller claim that religion helps people get together and do good things, and that's a big part, actually, of that book. And then he followed that book with American Grace, which he wrote with David Campbell, who's another sociologist, and they make very, very strong claims in that book. They say, for example, here I'll quote the exact phrase, the exact thing that they say. The pattern is so robust that evidence of it can be found in virtually every major national survey of American religious and social behavior. Any way you slice it, religious people are simply more generous. Oops, sorry, I got a phone call.
That's all right.
So, any way you slice it, religious people are simply more generous. It's actually an amazing claim, and if you think about what that would mean, if it's really true that, well, we have to talk about what does it mean religious, what does it mean when you say religious people, but let's say that meant believing in God.
Right.
If it was really true that believing in God made you a more generous person, then we would have a sort of a terrible choice in front of us, because we know that believing in God is stupid. And so we'd have a choice between having people believe in God and then become more generous. That's good. Generous is good.
Yes.
Or we would tell them to not believe in God, and then they would get stingier.
Right.
That would be terrible.
Can I just interrupt? Can I just interrupt here and add insult to injury? Several years ago, it must be 5 or 6 years ago, a woman by the name of Bobby Kirkhart, is that her name, or Bobby Kirkwood? Bobby Kirkhart, who used to be the president of Atheist Alliance International, did a internet radio interview with some Christian station. It was these two young guys, and they said that they had no doubt that there were atheists who were generous and good people, but they were doing it because they had the spirit of Christ, and they just didn't know it.
Yeah.
I mean, talk about dealing with cognitive dissonance, But that when as you were talking, it's reminded me of that kind of denial and that basic assumption that if an atheist is a good person, then clearly he or she has the love of God or the love of Christ, and they just don't know it. Why God would be so coy about that is beyond my ability. Yeah. All right, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you just happened to remind me of that.
So yeah, the question is, when the people who are talking about if atheists are generous, it must be because they have the Spirit of God in them. Well, that's an empirical claim, and I would like to know whether that's true. So that's the kind of thing you need to follow that up and say, okay, how would you find out?
Right.
How would you check that?
Right.
And so if Putnam and Campbell and all these other people who I'm quoting in my paper that's currently going through the peer review process, if these guys, the idea, if you're gonna talk science, you're gonna talk facts and what can we check, what can we actually find out, what can we look into and check, then you have to find, okay, to say that religious people are more generous than non-religious people is to say that you have a way of measuring generosity and you have a way of measuring religiosity, and when you make measurements on a bunch of people, a large group of people, you can see a positive correlation between those two things.
Right.
So when you do the statistics, you find that the people who have more religiosity, whatever that means, also have more generosity, whatever that means. You've got to quantify those things.
Right, because it would never have occurred to anyone to be generous if they hadn't gone into a house of worship. I mean, that's the assumption.
So, yeah, I mean, the claim is ridiculous on the face of it. And people who are atheists understand that in a way, the contention is absolutely absurd. But we have to contend with the fact that there's this literature out there that looks so professional, looks so convincing, because it's all based on numbers, and you can, and it's like, like Putnam and Campbell say, any way you slice it, because they're talking about their data, right? They're talking about analyzing statistical data. Any way you slice it, you find that religious people are more generous. So what I did was I started looking into the literature and thinking carefully about where they got their numbers and how they did their analysis. And what I found was that even though these are high-profile, highly respected social scientists, the analysis is simply invalid. They didn't do it right. They messed it up. They've got assumptions and biases that have just ruined the entire thing.
And it shaded the whole project from the start.
Say that again.
Well, because of their preconceived notions and biases, cultural biases, it shaded the whole thing right from the get-go.
It did, and I'm almost tempted to, when I read Putnam and Campbell, I'm tempted to be mad at them for misleading people, because the conclusions are just wrong, and the way that they were the procedure that they used to get to their conclusions is mistaken. But I think that most sociologists of religion just actually like religion. They like it. They think it's a good thing, and then they end up with that as a bias, and they forget that you've got to check things like that. So,
well, I think people start out. I don't know if I hate to use the term human nature, but you kind of start out from your own frame of reference, and I think maybe they were guilty of that. And just as a kind of a tangential example, I was reading a review in Skeptical, the magazine Skeptical Inquiry, and one of the books they were talking about was this reanalysis of that very famous case of the woman who was named Sybil and her multiple personalities, and it was debunked. And
I think I read that article too.
Yeah, and it wasn't so much a deliberate attempt to deceive anyone. It was kind of like mutual self-deception on both the parts of both people. And of course, now it's been debunked. I think nobody's attributing any kind of malice or deliberate, or a deliberate scam, but the people involved scammed themselves because they went into it with preconceived notions and couldn't separate themselves from it. So,
one of the amazing things that you find when you look into this literature is that all these results are based on surveys, and that's not a secret. They say it up front. They're big. I don't know if you're familiar with the field, but there are organizations that do surveys of the American population, and they publish them. Like there's one called the General Social Survey. It's done every other year. They survey something like 1,500 people, and they try to do it randomly so that it's representative of the United States. And they ask people about their belief in God. They ask them what they do for a living. They ask them what size household they live in, things like that. Social questions about how they live. And there are several of these projects that are ongoing year after year, and authors like Putnam and Campbell, what they've done is they take that data and they've analyzed the data statistically with software, and they find correlations between variables in the data. But when you think of their work from that point of view, there's a really severe problem that comes up right away and that's not addressed in the literature at all. And that is that, for example, again, quoting from their book, they say generosity can simply, I've got to get the quote just right, hold on a second, okay. Sure. Generosity can be measured most simply by measuring gifts of time and money. Sounds reasonable. Measuring gifts of time and money. But that sentence really jumped out at me when I was reading the book, because surveys don't measure gifts of time and money. When you do a survey and you answer questions, they're asking you for what psychologists call a self-report.
Right.
So it's just, again, this is the question of bias comes up. Everyone, and there's a special kind of bias that they talk a lot about in sociology and psychology called social desirability, where if someone asks you, how often do you wash your hands? Statistically, people will tend to exaggerate that because washing your hands is considered to be a good thing to do.
And everybody wants to believe that they're generous.
Everyone wants to believe they're generous. It's a perfect example of social desirability. If you wanted to find the best possible, the worst possible, the statistic that would be most vulnerable to social desirability bias, you would choose how generous are you? So that's the first thing, is that they're asking people, for example, how often do you give money to charity? How often do you... There's a whole list of things in Putnam and Campbell where they ask people, how often do you donate blood? How often would you let someone cut in front of you in line? How often would you give your seat to someone on the subway? If a cashier accidentally gives you too much change, would you give it back? They asked all.
I would, and I have.
I'm sorry. Say that again.
I would, and I have. I have given back. I have given back change for being overcharged or undercharged.
I believe you, but if I'm doing a scientific study, I'm not going to take your word for it. And
I don't blame you.
Yes. So,
I wouldn't take my word for it. No, just kidding.
So incredibly, in this big study that Putnam and Campbell did, they report that people who go to church more often are more likely to give blood and are more likely to give up their seat on the subway.
Right.
Based on those statistics.
Right.
It's kind of ridiculous. And then there's another twist also, if you want to talk about generosity and religiosity. And this is another elementary scientific, an elementary methodological problem that's not addressed in the literature. And what happens is, as a society, we have a thing called tax-deductible contributions.
Right.
They're also known as charity, very loosely called charity. So a charity is an organization that you can give money to and you can deduct it on your taxes. And we call giving to those kinds of organizations, we call doing that charity. But the thing is that charity, in that sense of the word, in the sense of tax deductible, charities include churches. And so when someone goes to church on Sunday and puts $20 in the collection plate, that's called charity. And so if you ask, are people who go to churches charitable, you might say, well, yeah, they're charitable because they're always giving money to the church. But that's not actually charity. If you really think about it, it's technically called charity because it can be deducted on their taxes, and because the church, when they receive that cash, they don't have to pay taxes on the income. So technically it's tax deductible, but the money that is given to churches in this country, we know that it's on the order of $100 billion a year is given to churches. And of that $100 billion, only a very small amount, on the order of 2%, actually ends up funding humanitarian efforts such as soup kitchens, housing for the homeless, and so on. The amount of money that goes into churches and then gets spent on welfare for strangers, for people who aren't congregation members, is very, very small. It's usually unrecognized. It's hard to find statistics about that. I had to work very hard to find any numbers on how that money gets spent. But it turns out that the amount is quite small. I think I read in Mark Chavez reported that the median expenditure of a single congregation in the United States on humanitarian programs is about $1,300 per year.
Yes, right.
And so half of the congregations spend less than that, and half of them spend more than that. Some do quite a bit of humanitarian work. Most do very, very little. $1,300 is not very much money over a whole year to spend on humanitarian efforts if you're a congregation. So there's
well, can I just interrupt? There's also the misconception about as far as non-believers and specifically atheists. There's a misconception, I think, generally about atheism, as though there was some kind of symmetrical argument going on that atheism is an absolutist response to the absolutism of religion, which it is not. And so therefore you get questions on the internet, well, why aren't there any atheist hospitals? As though it's atheism is the lack of belief in God. There isn't that. Even though it sounds like we're evading moral responsibility, it just so happens that by definition there is no moral responsibility implied to something that you just simply don't believe. It's not symmetrical. In other words, there's not. And in fact, atheists do give to religious charities because they're unaware of. There are secular charities, and I think they should become more and more known.
Yeah.
I mean, I've given to religious charities in the past.
Sure.
The
really big and really effective charities. The really big and really effective charities, things like Oxfam,
yes,
Doctors Without Borders,
yes,
UNICEF, the International Red Cross. Those are all perfectly secular. They have nothing to do with religion, and they're much bigger than religious charities.
Right.
I love the question about atheist hospitals because at first it sounds it's really scary. It's like, why aren't there any atheist hospitals?
Well, because we're evil and we don't care. Because we're horrible people. We don't care about the sick and the dying.
No, it's a misleading question. It's tough to. It takes you aback because you don't know how to put it aside. But I saw a wonderful blog post from, I think it was actually David Silverman, the American Atheist guy.
My boss.
He's your boss?
Yeah, because yeah.
Maybe it was someone else, but what I read was if you ask how many of the hospitals out there were built by atheists, the answer is all of them.
Wow.
And when you think about,
well, you're not going to leave us hanging. You gotta follow up on that.
I have to explain that.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, the number of really fervent believers in the United States is actually quite low. The number of staunch secularists is close to the same as the number of really strong religious believers. They're more or less on a par. So that means that if you hire 1,000 people to build a hospital, something like half of them are going to be more or less secular, more or less non-believers. At least, around half. Only a few of them only a small percentage are going to be really strongly religious.
Right, but I think amongst a lot of the secular people, though, they're kind of tacit believers, I would say. They kind of believe with a small b. It's kind of like what Daniel Dennett said, is it's not so much that people believe, it's people believe that they believe.
They believe that they believe. And in fact, you can make a case for the idea that there's no such thing as really seriously believing in God, because it's incoherent and you can't have a belief that isn't actually a proposition.
Right, and almost everyone behaves as though they were atheists. Almost everyone is forced to behave in order to survive as though there were no God, because if you just sit there and wait for God to protect you.
And there is no belief that corresponds to being an atheist, because an atheist is just not having a belief. So
that's right. Yeah.
So another reason to dismiss the question of why aren't there any atheist hospitals is you can ask, you can say, well, show me the religious hospitals. Which ones are the religious hospitals? Is it the one down the street from here that's nominally a Catholic hospital? It's called Mercy General. If you ask why a hospital would be called a Catholic hospital, it's mostly because it's owned by a nominally Catholic organization, right? It's owned by an organization that calls itself Catholic. It's not as if they practice Catholic medicine or something, you know. If you break your leg and you go in there, they're not going to give you a Catholic cast.
Right.
All the medicine is the same. The medicine at a Catholic hospital is the same as the medicine at a secular hospital.
Except they can withhold abortions if they want to.
Except in certain cases, if you're a woman and even if you're dying, they won't give you an abortion even to save your life.
Right.
So that's one difference.
Right.
But it's
there's
not
no
a difference. So in a way, it's misleading to talk about Catholic hospitals. First of all, they don't practice Catholic medicine. Secondly, they don't use Catholic money because most hospitals, they use public money, they use money from foundations, and of course they use money from people who go in there and pay for their treatment, or insurance pays for it. You know, if they give you if you went in there and they said anything you need, we'll treat you for free, that might be a kind of a religious thing.
Right.
That might be sort of a Christian thing if they never charged you any money.
Right. And there's no special Christian first law of thermodynamics. It's the first law of thermodynamics for everybody.
Exactly.
Whether there were human beings or not. So.
Right. So it's misleading. It's actually misleading to talk about religious hospitals because they're not really religious hospitals. You wouldn't want to go to a really religious hospital because then they try to cure you with prayer.
Right.
And
there have been incidences of people going into surgery who've been prayed over against their will, or have been asked if they wanted to be prayed over, and as if they need that worry just before the propofol kicks in, you know.
Yeah. So, well, let me mention before I know we're actually already running pretty long, but let me mention one more problem with these studies, these statistical studies that claim to show scientifically that religious people are more generous than non-religious people. To compare the two scientifically, you're going to have to quantify the two things. Quantify generosity, which we were just talking about all the problems in trying to quantify generosity the way these guys are trying to do it. Then there's the problem of quantifying how religious you are.
Right.
So if you want to compare religious people to non-religious people, you've got to come up with some sort of number for how religious people are. And so then the first problem with that is, again, it's a self-reported value.
Yes.
We can't get inside your brain and measure how religious you are. We might do something like we could count how often you go to church, but in general, in these studies, they don't count how often people go to church. They simply ask, and that tends to be exaggerated.
As if that had anything to do with one's ability to be generous.
And it doesn't have anything to do with one's ability to be generous. And then more fundamentally, more deeply, I think there's an interesting question about what is this generosity, what is this religiosity thing that we're trying to quantify? Like, imagine someone says to me, well, I'm really religious. You can tell how religious I am because I go to church every week. And someone else says, well, that's not really being religious. I mean, I never go to church, but I pray every day. Okay, how would you tell?
Right.
Someone else says, well, no, it's not there. It's sitting and meditating and becoming very still inside. That's really what being religious is.
Right.
Okay, how would you decide? In other words, we don't know. There's a story in Putnam and Campbell about where they say, when we count religious people, what we really mean is religious participation. So even if someone was an atheist, and let's say his wife is religious and he goes to help her at the soup kitchen or whatever it is, we would count him as a religious participant, even though he's an atheist.
Well, can I give you an example? Example. I was brought up in the Jewish tradition, and I can tell you that even amongst the really Orthodox Jews, they don't really care what you personally believe so much as what you do. That I could walk into a synagogue right now, declare I'm an atheist, but if I was willing to do the prayers and do the rituals, that would be fine. They may disagree with me, but as far as they're concerned, I've fulfilled myself in that way. So you can be an atheist and you can walk through go through the motions. And most people are gonna deny being atheist because the atmosphere, the zeitgeist right now does not support coming out as being an atheist. Although I think through people such as yourself and Hitchens and Dawkins and hopefully New York City atheists, it's favorable.